It's 3:10. So, good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming. This is how to audit Drupal sites for performance, content, and best practices. My name is Jon Peck. I'm a senior engineer at Four Kitchens. It's a digital agency based out of Austin, Texas. I've been working with them for about 2.5 years. Prior to that, I worked at Pantheon Systems as a senior customer success engineer. Some of the tools and techniques that I'm talking about are things that I developed specifically for that position and are still being used today. Yeah, I can be found on the internet as Flux Sauce. So, all right, what is an audit? An audit, technically, is an official inspection of accounts. It's kind of a scary word, especially like around tax season, which is coming up, and I've already got my tax bill for this year, and it's not pretty. But audits aren't necessarily a bad thing, because they can validate the good things. They can say, hey, based on these metrics, based on these tests, the things that you're doing actually are good. They are within particular boundaries. They can also highlight areas of improvement, which is kind of managerial speak of like calling you out on the bad things that you were doing. But it's good to have a record of that. It's like, hey, what you've done is outside the norm. At the very least, is calling attention to it. If you make an intentional decision to do it that way, that's fine. But at least you've had the attention called to it. So, why do you want to audit a site or a Drupal site in particular? Well, there's a number of reasons. Some people work at agencies that are doing support work. Sometimes you've adopted a new project. Sometimes you have an existing project that you've been maintaining and keeping track of, and you want to know kind of what's going on behind the scenes. So it's useful to learn about the structure and the contents of the site. Just kind of looking, seeing how the sausage is made and seeing exactly how much of something you have. It's also for ensuring optimal configuration. For example, we're human, we make mistakes. Preparing a site for a production environment involves a lot of configuration. All it takes is missing one checkbox and suddenly your site isn't caching in a production environment. And that's kind of a problem. Or you were messing around, you were doing some analysis, and you accidentally left on a development module, for example. That provides a potential vector for people who are up to no good. So, and also obviously discovering areas of improvement. Again, it's what are the good things that I'm doing? What are the bad things I'm doing? Based on general best practices, am I doing the right thing? So every site is unique. We're all unique snowflakes. But at least in the context of Drupal, which is why we're here, they're all built with the same kind of framework. I mean, it could be Drupal 7, it could be Drupal 8, it could be Drupal 6, but sorry, you really need to get off of that. It's officially a plugin, so that's not my problem. They also all have similar architectural environment requirements. So, for the most part, a lamp stack or something kind of thing, similar to it. I mean, it can be Apache, it can be Nginx, it can be IIS if you really want to be hateful to yourself. But the same general principle applies. You have some kind of relational database, you have a web server, you have PHP, which will actually run the executable code. So within this kind of context, one size will fit most. There will always be exceptions, and that's okay. The idea is just to be aware that I am an exception. Why am I an exception? And then you can explore that on your own. So there are a number of hallmarks of an effective audit. First of all, you want to be consistent. Each time you run a particular test, you want the same result if nothing changed. So it's like, I expect the sky to be blue, and I look outside and the sky is blue, and then I say, okay, I expect the sky is going to be blue. It's not suddenly going to be purple. It's still going to be blue. Quantifiable. So if you have a test, for example, and this is something that you'll hear in various kind of support roles, is like, this site is slow. That's not quantifiable. That's qualitative. That's not actual information. The site takes 30 seconds to load. That's quantifiable. That's an actual number. That's something that you can really work with. It needs to be contextually aware. So if you're auditing a development environment, it shouldn't yell at you that you have development tools on it. It makes sense to have that should be aware of like certain kinds of exceptional situations. Like I don't want to be doing coding standard checks against content produced by features, because features, well, is generated code, and it doesn't make sense for a human to go back through and fix it unless you're the actual module maintainer. The auditing results need to be easy to understand, which it's easy to say that, but the point being is whatever the results are, you need to be able to understand what you need to do, what these results mean. I mean, it's one thing to like say, you're doing badly. Oh, I'm sorry. It's like, versus like, you have caching turned off, and this is what you need to do to turn it on. And that brings me to the last point of having actionable recommendations. It's one thing to say, this is kind of strange. Why have you done this? And it's another thing to say, this is out of the norm. Here's what you can do to fix it. And so, so it's making sure that both the context is there, and just making sure that you can empower whoever is actually going to be acting on it, so they know what to do. So the type of analysis that I prefer is referred to as static program analysis. So trying to step away from the program. It's a technique of performance and behavior analysis that doesn't actually execute the site. In the case of Drupal, it's happening kind of on the back end. It doesn't actually need, in a perfect world, it doesn't actually have to be installed within the site. This makes sense, especially in the context of a platform such as Pantheon, in which it's not appropriate to install a tool on every single site just to do checks. It makes better sense to have something that can interact with it kind of from an outside. So you can, so it doesn't have to be installed, and also it's like trying to do it in an automated way. So you don't have to manually configure a whole bunch of things every time you want to run a test. You kind of set it up once, and then you can run it on, say, a regular schedule or just with a single command. So there are a number of tools for auditing. I'm going to talk about one that I was heavily involved with, by which I wrote it, but I'm also going to mention a bunch of other ones. The tool that I worked on is called Site Audit. It's a Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 site analyzer. Thanks to Drupal Summer of Code, I worked with a student engineer from India, and we collaborated and built the Drupal 8 version, which was available for Drupal 8 launch, which is fantastic. On the back end, it's actually just a drush command that is installed on the target platform. And I say platform, it can also be installed on your local machine, and so you can run it on sites that you have installed on your computer. It produces reports in many formats. First of all, drush format. It'll also put out HTML. It'll also put out JSON. And Site Audit powers launch check on Pantheon. I believe that there is now kind of a WordPress version of launch check. I'm not quite sure what it's branded as. This is distinct from that. Site Audit checks a whole bunch of things. I'm going to run through these relatively quickly because a couple of them will get into more deeper detail. It checks for best practices, like for example, like how you structure the site. Is this kind of if it's in the context of Pantheon, for example, are you using multi-sites or not, which isn't supported on the platform, or are you, do you have the site laid out in a logical way, or have you tried to mess around with the default Drupal structure? It checks blocks to see like is block enabled, what kind of block caching do you have running. It also will do cache auditing. So it'll tell you like what kind of caching backend you're using. Say if you're using the database as a caching backend, or if you're using a key value store such as Redis or Memcache, for example. It will also check the code base itself. So it can, depending on what you have installed and what you have available, it can tell you the size of the code base. Like you have 200 megs worth of modules are installed, which is a bit unusual, but it happens. It can also tell you things like the number of lines of code, even only the custom code. Content, which is the the quantity and the quality sorted. So it'll tell you like more information about content types, fields that aren't used, for example. It's like, hey, have you considered getting rid of these, or you have these content types that have absolutely nothing in them? Let's see. Cron basically is like, do you have some mechanism that is running cron? It doesn't really matter what. Are you using something like Ultimate or Elysia cron? Are you executing it manually? Have you turned it completely off and it hasn't run in a couple of weeks? That's kind of a problem. You need to do something about that. The database. So it'll do a bunch of checks against the database, including just kind of how many tables are there, based on a minimum threshold, what are the largest tables in the site. So if you say, show me all the tables that have more than 1 million rows, for example. It'll also check for the type of storage engine they're using, like DB or MyASM, for example. Extensions, which is just the kind of catch-all phrase for both modules and themes. So it'll do things like checking for counts, like how many extensions are there. Like 150 is an arbitrary number, but it's used it's like you have more or less than the average. If you have, say, 300 extensions enabled on your site, are you sure that's what you want to be doing? It'll also check for development extensions, as I mentioned, things like devel, and if it's running in a production environment, it'll recommend that you turn it off. It'll checks for joke extensions and things that are known to be really, really bad. There's what's like extensions of the bad judgment module, for example. It'll tell you not to use that. It's also contextually aware and will recommend that, say, in Aquia environments, you don't run Redis, and in Pantheon environments, you don't run Memcache because they just don't offer them. It does some front-end checks. This isn't really a front-end tool, but it does have some incorporation with sites like Google PageSpeed Insights and webpage.org. This is dependent on the ability to actually send an API call to an environment. Basically, if it's running locally, I wouldn't run it, but if it's on a hosted environment, you can actually tell it to produce the report in a standardized way. There's security audits, checking for malicious entries in the menu system, for example, which I believe that was also ported to Drupal 8, so kind of cool that we have some of the first Drupal 8 security scans, but also will integrate with other modules such as security review, which I'll get into. System status. Drupal is actually really good at telling you what's going on behind the scenes, and so this will surface those reports, and that sometimes will come from third-party modules that will tell you, hey, everything's configured correctly, except you forgot this library over here. Therefore, I can't parse, geospatial information. There's a users check, which will give you just kind of like basic information. Who's user number 1? Are they blocked? What roles are there? Just providing some context and how many people are blocked. Views configuration. Do you have views enabled? If so, are you caching views effectively? Views has a couple different kinds of caching. It has the result caching and it has the query caching. Result caching is the rendered HTML, which you want to save as long as possible, and then the query caching is the actual raw database query. If the raw database query changes, then the result caching is automatically invalidated. So it's usually a good idea to set the result caching as long as possible. And the query caching, that's dependent on your individual site needs. That's usually a business decision. Like if your content doesn't change very often, it'd be fine. But there are some sites that's like, yeah, if I get published, I want everything to invalidate immediately and have the results available that second. So it depends on the context. And then finally, Drupal Watchdog, the built-in database logging system. If you're using syslog, it doesn't interact with that. You should, if you're clever enough to use that, you should also be able to use something like Graylog and be able to parse those logs. But if you're using Watchdog, it'll check for things like PHP errors, which should be fixed. It'll check for the size of it, if it's enabled, and make a recommendation whether or not you should rotate it. So Site Audit does not analyze everything. For example, it does not analyze usability and site experience. These are dumb tools. These are algorithms that are running and just giving you output that will make contextual sense, but it doesn't really care about how the site is, how you interact with the site. And with that, the statics, for example, is like it doesn't care if it's blue and orange and green with like blinking text. It's not going to check for that, nor should it. That's something that humans are better oriented to do. Which again, my recommendation for Jody's talk gets more into like the actual interactions with a site. And also semantic content. It doesn't really care what language the content is in. It doesn't really care, if you use foul language in it or not. It's just looking to see, what the quantity of the content is and how it's actually structured. So using Site Audit, it's a drush command. Oh, sorry, yes.
It's as you were going through this, I was wondering, what about image optimization? Is there anything attacking that or addressing that?
No, no.
Okay. Just curious.
So sites like webpagetest.org will give you recommendations around whether or not the images are optimized, or but it won't give you Drupal specific contextual information like, hey, you should use JPEG tram or was it PNG optimize or PNG crush, for example.
Perfect, thank you.
That's a decent suggestion, though. It's like just like, hey, you're not using anything like this. I'm going to think about that, just like how best to proceed with that. But anyway, okay. So usage. It is a drush command. I'm going to. If you're not familiar with it, drush is a command line interface used for interacting with Drupal sites. You can find more information about it at drush.org. So you just type drush help -- filter equals Site Audit. Site Audit is the name of the system, and it will give you a list of all the commands. Things like audit all, which will run every single report, audit best practices, and blog, and so forth. So you can run the individual tests and actually you have the ability to filter that as well and say audit all, everything except, say, Google PageSpeed Insights, for example. Now this is an example of drush audit cache, where there's a number of things that I'd like to highlight. So, and it's a little bit small, so I'll just read it out. So here's the title of the report, Drupal's caching settings, and it'll give you an arbitrary number because in this case it's 31%. It's based on the number of tests that failed or or just kind of in a warning state. If everything is good, it's 100%. Humans can kind of rock like that percentage. You have, here's the check, anonymous caching, and then the check result. Anonymous page caching is not enabled. That's a problem. It considers that an error, and then it gives you the actual recommendation. Go to admin config development performance and check cache pages for anonymous users. It gives you that context. Now, there might be a very good reason why you haven't done that. Probably not, though. It's probably a mistake. So, and it goes through for each one of them. The minimum cache lifetime, this is a warning. So minimum cache lifetime is set to 1 minute. There may have been a good reason for that, but probably not. It's considered best practice for most sites to have the minimum cache lifetime set to none, and so forth. There is also a detail mode where it will give you every single check. This mode will only tell you the things that have gone wrong. Detail will tell you every single thing. The things that have passed and are correct. And also things that are just purely informational. For example, lock API. To determine the default locking mechanism, okay, it's using Redis. Nothing particularly actionable about that. That's not good or bad. It just is. It'll tell you that. And part of the thought behind this was, it's like most people, when they want to check a site, don't flood me with lots of information. Only tell me what I need to know. Only tell me the things that are bad. So we have the ability to see like this, really kind of geeky information about the site, or things that, as a engineer who's making decisions about it, needs for context. But for most usage, you just want to know what's wrong. There's also JSON output. This is what is used to power Site Audit. And there's, it's not perfect, and I have an outstanding kind of action item to clean this up a little bit, but there is, for each check, it has an action, a label, a result, and a score. The score is kind of arbitrary. It's like 0 if it's neutral information, 1 if it's a pass, -1 if it's an error. And the result information is textual, the label and description and so forth. So it offers it up in a structured format. There's also HTML output. So for any particular report, you can render it as HTML. It's as bare bones as possible, because there is also an, for the audit all system, it will has support for Bootstrap as well. So it'll put out I think it's Bootstrap 3. Yeah, probably Bootstrap 3. Along with the navigation that has been color-coded, because humans like to respond to color most of the time. So, and it has the accessibility aspect of also having the percentage displayed as well. So if you can't correct the colors, then you can actually see the result. So, best practices, 3% green, hey, I don't have to do anything. Block is red, that's a problem. And so it'll just generate this report. This is something that you could actually put in front of a client, and they could pretty easily understand. It's like, hey, there's a bunch of things that need improvement. They don't necessarily have to know what needs to be done. By the way, you want to check to see this?
I am.
Cool, thank you. Site Audit does come with a lot of things out of the box. I've also tried to make the tests, the checks in it, as kind of evergreen as possible. Like, I don't want to be in a kind of whack-a-mole game, similar to like virus scanners that have signatures. So, but other modules do, and also just offer things that I think, in some cases are just, too specific, or I just hadn't thought of. Other modules, third-party modules, can implement both the checks, the individual checks, and the reports themselves. Like, for example, views is a report, and then there's individual checks, like is views enabled, is views caching enabled, and so forth. You can submit feature requests in the issue queue for on Drupal.org for Site Audit if you think that something needs to be included, and I can work with the module maintainer. There's also extensive documentation available. It's up on GitHub and Drupal.org. So there are a number of organizations, some of which are here, that have actually contributed checks to Site Audit. We are an open source. We at Four Kitchens, put things out there, with the idea that other people can leverage the code, and be able to, learn basically from our experiences, so we can all be on the same base level, rather than having, keeping the keys close to our chest and say this is a proprietary trade secret. No, this is open source software. Come on, let's work together. So now I'm going to start getting into some modules that have integration with Site Audit, but also can be run as standalone. Unused modules is an example of that. It stands for, well, exactly that. Unused modules and projects that can be safely deleted. So it'll check for things as like, is this enabled and and nothing else is depending on it? No, well then it can probably be safely removed from the code base. It'll ignore disabled child modules, for example. So with the, I'll pick on views. Views has a user interface that can be enabled or disabled. So if you have Views UI disabled, it's not going to ask you to remove that because it is actually part of the parent module that is enabled. Security review is an absolutely fantastic system, and it does exactly that. It gives you does a check for a number of really low-level things, and sometimes like things like untrusted roles do not have administrative trusted Drupal permissions, versus base URL is not set in settings.php, so someone can find ways to exploit that. Or errors are written to the screen. You never want to display errors to the general user because that can lead to, well, it's an information leak and it will give them additional context about the system. It does check both the site and the hosting configuration. We'll also do like permission checks and it goes really, into really low level detail. And both of these modules have integration with Site Audit, so you have the ability to run it as part of the same ecosystem and have those results surface in the same way. You can also run it as this example, as a standalone. Hacked is another neat module. It will, it does a comparison of the versions of a module that, and also of Drupal itself that are on Drupal.org and what you actually have in your site. It's a little bit out of date. What it will do right now is just download a particular module and do a diff and highlight it if something's off. If you're using something like PressFlow, don't use it on Drupal itself because it's going to be completely freaked out by that. It also does not have Git support. It has CPS support, so if you remember that, Drupal.org moved away from CPS a few years ago, so it hasn't been super well maintained, but for just kind of like a gut check to make sure that either someone hasn't gotten clever and made a patched version of one of your modules, or there's been an exploit and someone's actually put in some malicious code. This is a great tool for detecting that. Cache audit is another tool. There is a little bit of crossover with a cache auditing functionality that is in Site Audit, but it will also, it goes a bit deeper and will analyze panels, which we're not doing, and Dom's opinion, like actually say for each one of them, what the region is, what the cache is, lifetime, and so forth. Panels is unique, it's not in Site Audit. PHP Code Sniffer Encoder. This is actually not a Drupal specific system, but it actually has Drupal support through the Coder module. So PHP Code Sniffer is a tokenizer, and what it does is it looks over all the scripts that you've written, preferably everything in your custom modules and so forth, and checks for coding and standard errors using both the Drupal and the Drupal practice sniffs. It detects deviations from Drupal coding standards. Coding standards are important because it helps create a uniform code base that other developers can easily navigate and understand, kind of like the logic and look and feel, rather than dealing with stylistic changes like why are you using tabs versus spaces, or why have you named this variable something really horrible. Use like this type of tool will detect it. I will say, and this is something that I brought up in avoiding over-engineering, if you have an existing site and you run a tool like Coder on your site and it gives you a whole bunch of things that you've done wrong, don't panic and try to fix it all at once. And take kind of a Boy Scout approach where you leave it better than you found it. Like each time you touch a particular site area, just clean it up like around what you're doing. And over time, the overall quality of the code base will improve. Related to that is parreview.sh. That is also the domain. If you've ever submitted a project on Drupal.org for actual, for publishing permissions, this is a system that you have to use. It actually will run things like PHP Code Sniffer, along with a few other tools, and run the same kind of analysis on your content. If you are a module maintainer, I would say run it on your own code base and help elevate your project and also find areas of improvement. In addition to PHP Code Sniffer, there's a number of other PHP tools that have some kind of similar functionality. PHP Copy Paste Detector does exactly that. It looks for duplicated code that is appearing multiple times in an effort. It's good both for detecting lazy programming and also or people who feel that it's important to be paid by the line of code rather than the effective results that they're producing. PHP Mess Detector, which checks for possible bugs, unused unreachable or overcomplicated expressions. You know, if you have like lots of nesting or lots of recursive calling, it might call you out on that. PHP lines of code, which will measure the size and structure of custom code. This is, I made the point of like, lines of code is a metric. It should not be the metric. Do not use it as a sole reference for like how good an engineer is. With that said, if someone works for a week and produces 10 lines of code, they're probably not doing what they're supposed to be doing. There are a few Git tools that I recommend. Git stats, which is a statistics generator. This is useful especially if you're not using a hosted system like GitHub, which does actually have some built-in statistics, but this will also get into much greater detail. Git inspector is another tool. It's again, it's a statistical analysis tool. So it'll produce, they'll produce results kind of like this, in addition to some textual information where you have this graph over time, like of the activity on a site. And this is a real-world graph. This is when the site was actively being worked on, and then when it was delivered to the client, and then the one developer was working on it. This is something that is good for context. Like, oh, hey, the last time that somebody was really actively working on the site was back in 2014, and since then it's just kind of been limping along. Again, like, what actionable recommendations come out of that? Not much. But you do know, but they will tell you like who has put in the most time, the most code, and when that development was happening. So again, it's just giving you context into the site. There's some JavaScript tools that I recommend, things like ESLint. It's a pluggable linting utility. Linting is checking for syntax errors, for JavaScript and JSX. It will also checks for coding standard deviations, for example, are best practices. Things like recommending the use of strict, for example. JSCS is for JavaScript code style, and it does that. JSHint is a community-driven tool that detects errors and potential problems. JSHint and ESLint have a lot of crossover, and they occasionally kind of get snaky with each other on GitHub issue queues, which is kind of funny. For whatever it's worth, Drupal 8 actually includes ESHint configuration, and they moved away from both of these tools and consolidate on that one. Now, I'm going to get into some more front-end tools that you can use. These are free tools. Webpagetest.org is absolutely fantastic for analyzing the front end of a site. You can run it today, and it'll give you both what I consider like hallmarks of a good test. Of like, these are the things that are bad, and you can actually go into that and see why is this recommendation bad. It'll provide waterfall views, so how the page is being built. Webpagetest specifically will do 2 checks. It'll fetch the page once, and then it'll fetch it a second time in an effort to see, it's like, hey, how effective is the caching? Because you can have a really heavy page, but if the second load of it doesn't run faster, that can indicate some caching configuration problems. Also something, so it'll tell you things like the time that it takes, the number of requests, the number of bytes that it took to actually render the page, and including fully loaded, so all the assets, not just the ones served up, but the things that are required by all the JavaScript libraries that you might be using. And then there's this cost over here, which is fantastic, because in addition to the actual page weight, many developers have gotten used to having fast internet connections, and we need to be cognizant that not everybody who uses a particular site has a fast internet connection, especially in developing countries, especially in rural areas. Most people use mobile devices to access content, and also especially the more remote it is, the more expensive it is, literally, to access access the site. So if you click those dollar signs, it will take you to another site which will tell you the actual cost for a particular geographic region for a page.
Wow.
And you're just like, okay, well that sounds fine. It's like, yeah, well if your home page costs $1.50 to look at, people aren't going to go to see it. So this kind of context is good. Google PageSpeed Insights produces some very kind of a different, I would say like much fuzzier results. Runs some of the same kinds of tests, will give you some of the same kind of recommendations, things like whether or not you're minifying the resources or if your images are optimized and so forth. It also will provide you with a lovely color and quantifiable results, and also will tell you what you need to do. For example, eliminate render blocking JavaScript and CSS in the above the folded content, and then show how to fix it. It will actually give you links to documentation that will tell you what you need to do. Again, hallmarks of a good auditing tool. Another system that I was made aware of actually doing one of these presentations is the Wave Web Accessibility Tool. It's available at wave.webaim.org. It analyzes web pages for accessibility and for things like you have navigational elements that aren't necessarily labeled as such, or you have links that don't have titles and so forth, and it provides actionable recommendations on how to fix those problems. So, and also lists things both as errors, as alerts, as features, and also just basic analysis. Gosh, that's a lot of information. All at once. How do you distill it? What do you do? What do you do with it? Especially if you're doing this as trying to prepare a report for someone and giving actionable recommendations, because this is a whole bunch of different tools. So a report that you can, if you're compiling it, high level, I mean, having a review and actionable recommendations, just straight up front, like if you're handing someone a document, because you can very easily give them hundreds of pages of output from all these tools, and that doesn't mean a wet slap. It's like that's just kind of noise. It's like as an engineer, you need to review the results and kind of structure it in a way that they understand, like what needs to happen. Like having a summary paragraph, an elevator pitch version of it is good. You can take all that data, all that analysis, and put it in an appendix. Make it something that you can navigate to, especially if you say, here are my recommendations, or here's what I found, and then 3 months later, after you've done everything, you can actually go back and do a comparison with what the data had been saying before. Again, going back to an early example that I made, like, hey, this web page is slow. It's like, okay, when we started, it took 10 seconds. Now it takes 0.5 seconds to load, and you have that historical data so you can make that comparison. Also, something that's helpful if you're doing this as an agency, for example, or as a consultant, is also provide context, like how to install and use the tools to be able to measure the success. So any developer working on it will know that what they've done is like, okay, here's this failing test. If I run this tool after I've made those changes, I should see that it is now passing. And then also finally the raw results, so you have that context. A tool that I recommend for structuring large reports like this is Gitbook. It's an open source tool. It is also a commercial service, but you can actually use it as a standalone tool available through NPM. It's a book format tool chain that uses Git, surprise, and Markdown, which is structured text format. It's a command line tool. There's actually now, I should put in a link to it. There's now a GUI version of this, so if you don't like working with raw structured text, you can actually move content around and do formatting. It outputs HTML, PDF, which is fantastic, and even ebooks. It leverages the Libre open source ebook management system to do all the generation of that. I find it incredibly useful for generating large structured reports. And I mentioned like having that kind of like introduction, and then here are the actionable recommendations, and then at the end having an appendix, like having like one file per tool output, for example. So practically, this looks like using Atom. Here's the structure. every site has a kind of, every Git book has a summary, which is basically the table of contents. This is how you can define the structure of the document, as opposed to like trying to do this in a tool like Microsoft Word or Google Docs, for example, where if you want to restructure the order of things, like if I want to put recommendations up at the top, then it involves a giant copy and paste, and especially when you're dealing with dozens of pages of content, that can get a bit messy. This, you just move a line. And the end result is actually much cleaner. This is the HTML format. This is something that you can publish on GitHub pages, for example, or on your own hosted page. You can also run it locally. I find it really useful for large structured reports. I've tried using it for site documentation, and I don't recommend it actually, because nobody bothers to generate the results. It might look good as a deliverable, but practically on a day-to-day basis. I'm a human, and I'm really busy, and site auditing is not honestly the only thing that I've been doing. I've been maintaining the module for the past few years, but I'm going to actually raise my hand and say I need help. So if anybody is interested in contributing to open source software, there's a fantastic ecosystem. There's a vision of where to go, from where it is now. You will not be alone. I'm not abandoning the project, but I am looking for additional engineers who are interested in contributing code. So if you're interested, submit an issue or get a hold of me one way or the other. Just kind of as a capstone, good configuration matters. This is new relic results of an actual Pantheon hosted enterprise customer who I work with, who gave me hey, the site is slow, and I went and took a look, and actually caching was configured incorrectly, and I gave, among other things, and I gave them a punch list of recommendations, and they did it. And then there's that little, there's that little hiccup as the cold caches were taken care of, and then this is the time in PHP, this is the time in database. So they didn't make any code changes. They just made a little tweak to configuration based on actual recommendations. So that's it. Thank you very much for your time. Does anybody have any questions? Yes?
Yeah, if you had to pick, in addition to your module, if you had to pick extra 3 out of all what you presented, which ones would those be?
The tools that I personally use, I'm particular to Site Audit, just given my relationship with it, but also the fact that it has integration with a bunch of other tools. If you are looking, unused modules is a nice quick tool that will just tell you exactly that. Security review, though, is like I recommend on any platform. It's good to have that security context. And then something like Google PageSpeed Insights or webpagetest.org, you can run that today. You don't have to sign up. You don't need an API key. You can just paste in the URL and have it analyze your site and give you recommendations. Yes?
How often should it be run?
Running all of these tests, I would only do that like on an annual basis. But for, say, a production site, it's like running, if you have something like Site Audit installed, you can actually set it up to run on a cron job and send output to an email if you want. You can also just run it on your own, like say once a month. I would run it on a semi-regular basis, like I wouldn't do it more than once a week. The checks that are running on Pantheon are updated once per hour, but are a extreme subset. They're not all of the checks. It's just checking to see, like, do you have development modules enabled in a production environment and so forth. So it's kind of a fuzzy answer. It's like it depends. I wouldn't bother doing like this tear down, like run every single one of those tools, unless you're doing it to alleviate ignorance of a site, or it's like, hey, it's time to clean house and like see exactly what's here and what needs to go. Yes?
But your slides are going to be posted on the page.
Absolutely.
Okay, great.
So yeah, I make a PDF version, always available.
Sweet.
Anything else? All right, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. This is a great audience. Thank you.